choice among many that the BBC would tap to get the local reporting. Where
Sure.
it's understood that you do have a perspective.
Because they really don't understand.
I actually do believe in objectivity as a goal. That said, however, there's always an element of subjectivity in the very choice of what to cover.
Absolutely.
And the choice of what to cram into the 1,000 words that you have in the 8 minutes.
I want to add one small note, which is I think I made my career on covering the story after the fancy news crews flew home. Like my original wins that earned me the right to go overseas were staying on the ground when others flew in and out. So there's also an opportunity in that.
For sure. Let me ask the question du jour that simply cannot be escaped today, and that is about the role of artificial intelligence in creating a further disruption to an already very disrupted industry. Robert, what is your view of that? You could feed ChatGPT or whatever a bunch of facts, say, write me the best story for this kind of audience. You could actually ask for 3 different kinds of audiences. You'll get a pretty good story. Better written than a lot of what I had to edit when I was working with my former employer. And yet, it could be plagiarized, it could be wrong, it could be biased, yet the financial pressures, I think, to make use of this tool are going to be irresistible. What is it going to do to journalism?
Well, it's a big question facing journalism educators, and I would say educators in general, because you never know who's written the paper that's been turned in or the story that's being turned in, and that's the same question readers are going to have. I personally think readers will be ultimately scandalized when they find out they're reading something that was written by a black box with no accountability. So I'm very cynical about it. I have good friends who think, well, we just have to embrace it, learn how to use it, and so forth. But I think I'm one of the more fearful ones, frankly. I do want to get back to the previous question, though, just for a moment, if I may, and that is about local reporters. In the School of Journalism, we used to send a lot of students abroad over the years to intern with Western news organizations, the AP, for example, but other broadcast organizations. But in more recent years, it began to be harder and harder to get those organizations to take on what they saw as a liability of having students come in and do internships. And so we were tending to send our students, our American students, into working with local journalists and local news organizations and be supervised and under the tutelage, so to speak, of local reporters, which was frustrating in a way that they weren't able to get those same internships that they had before, but it was also a very rich experience for them to go in and work for a Moroccan newspaper or a Panamanian news service. And they would come back and tell stories that I think were extremely interesting to other students to realize there are these other opportunities. And as one of the panelists said, that the important thing is to go and be on the ground, which is something that AI frankly can't do. AI, I've played around with it. It doesn't take very long to figure out something that's been written by AI, and it will get better. But you can tell a big difference between something that's really been locally reported on, not just talked about, but actually reported on with real sources, as opposed to an AI written story that relies on other already published outlets.
For sure, the reporting aspect becomes ever more important. I have to say also, perhaps the subjective aspect, because as news organizations seek to be more and more distinctive, because the news events themselves are commoditized, that has raised, I think, the role of opinion and analysis and investigation as well. But I feel the need to ask our ethicists on the panel your view of 2 things that have just been said or been discussed. One, the journalistic model that attaches to Maria's openness about representing one side of the conflict, good, bad, or indifferent. And 2, this question of AI, which will get better and better to the point where the visible boundaries between the machines and ourselves are blurred and even in some people's eyes erased. Is it ethical?
Well, regarding the question of objectivity and reporting on wars and so forth, or any situation, I suppose it depends very much on how you state your mission. if you say, you know, in your about page, maybe you do, that you stand on our media's side in reporting news, that your publication seeks to advance our media's interests and looks at things through that perspective, then it is what it is. And I don't think there's anything you need to apologize for. I think that's quite correct and clear. And then you're being clear to your readers what perspective you take. And it doesn't mean that it's propaganda, but it just means that you look at this perspective. They should not expect to find in your pages a deeply reasoned pro-Azerbaijani view of the war. And that's just being open. It's a question of mission and being clear about it. As for AI, well, it's sort of a plagiarism machine at the moment. Products written by AI, ChatGPT is the one I'm most familiar with, look like sort of a first-year student trying to fake something using Wikipedia. I asked, since I knew you were going to ask about AI, I asked ChatGPT, well, what about AI in journalism? And it wrote this long, 500 words about it. And one of the paragraphs said, one concern is that AI-generated news stories may lack the human touch that is essential for effective storytelling. Automated news stories may lack the creativity and empathy that human journalists bring to their work. Well, both of those sentences are plagiarized from different places. I mean, a couple words have been changed, a little word substitution, but essentially it's a compendium of what other people have written. There is that problem, which is a pretty serious one. It means that AI, at the moment at least, is unlikely to come up with any original thought. And if we're paying journalists, or you're going to a news medium in order to find something you don't know, you presumably want to find something that isn't just already on the web. You want to find something new. And it's the tendency of pretty much everything that you get from ChatGPT is sort of on the one hand, on the other hand. You know, at the end it says, as the debate around AI in journalism continues, it's important for news organizations to carefully consider the potential benefits and drawbacks of automation. So it's very 50-50. And this, it's open-minded, certainly, but it also, sort of fuels the idea that all things are equal and everyone's argument is the same, which, taken to an extreme, can lead you to complete cynicism in the sense that there's no right, there's no wrong, there's no facts. It's all on the one hand, on the other hand, so think what you want. It might be more dangerous if it did take positions that were inappropriate, but at the moment, it's sort of like plain oatmeal, and it feels like some reading until you think about it, and then you realize it didn't really say very much.
I'm mindful of the fact that we do want to take questions from the audience here. I do want to ask one last question to whoever wants to field it, which relates, I think, to my first one. I have two daughters in their 20s. They don't like to read the long articles I write, and they're both brilliant. It's a little dispiriting. Like their entire
Maybe it says something about your articles.
I have considered that, and I've tried to write more entertainingly, and even introduce some video, but nothing helps because it kind of looks like this new generation consumes short-form video, and if you're really lucky, short-form text, or maybe text overlays on the video. Now, Tom was saying in his first answer to my question, well, maybe we can produce the news that's important in that form, essentially, or in more engaging forms. But it's difficult to find depth in those forms. It really is. So my question is really to anyone, including to our young, vivacious audience, does journalism have a duty to bring the audience to where depth is? Or must we bring ourselves to where the audience is? Anyone?
It's a diversity of formats, and that's fair. Because that's our job, is the production line. And what I found with News Deeply is I made it easy for us because in the world of millions of different interest groups that are passionate about this or passionate about that. We experimented with writing for the most passionate, the people who want the depth, which is similar to EVN report. What we found is when we did that, we could cover, and that gave us a lot of credibility. When you write for and among people who truly know what's going, what the, expertise, you get that depth, but you can take bite-sized chunks of it. If you have that knowledge, and if you're producing it from a process that involves good craft and good hunting out the most relevant questions, not the disproportionately sexy aspect of the story, but the truly important, relevant piece of the story, and then rigorously reporting it, you can break it down into a series. You could put it into a 4,000 word article. You can then take pieces of it and make it more digestible. But it does end up being as smart, I find. And that's fair. I think that's fair. There are different platforms, different formats, different levels of commitment to that story in particular. Maybe the young person who is snacking on short form video, if they found that long form piece about the sociology of their favorite sport, something that's really a deeper thing, that's what's going to catch them for the longer read.
My concern is about a two-tier society, honestly, where a small group of people is going to be reading the EVN report and they'll be paying double, as Robert mentioned, for the New York Times, and they'll be educated and knowledgeable, and probably it'll be a prosperity that feeds upon itself. Whereas the majority of people are snacking not on a trailer for the 4,000 word piece, but on the two-headed cat and the UFO.
We're in that world now. So if you want to correct for it, the 4,000 worders are going to have to start migrating.
Yeah, can I just say something very quickly? I've been exceedingly stubborn in maintaining the integrity of what we started. But we have also understood that we need to diversify the way we deliver that information. And so it's about remaining true to your mission. So for example, we have experimented with comics journalism, right? Because for our festival, we wanted to invite Joe Sacco, who's considered, the father, the inventor, the purveyor of that. So we podcasts and different things, but it's about not losing sight of the mission that you have, and that's a difficult balance to have. But I think that I don't want to end up being a 1950s kitchen that nobody wants to come and eat in. We also have to try to appeal to that audience without losing the integrity of what we're trying to do.
So what I'm hearing from everyone here is that we do have a role that is ethical and almost educational, beyond the business aspect of it. But everyone here is a journalist. And the question really is who's running these journalistic operations. I'll let you the audience if anyone has a question for that. Please. Yeah, announce it and direct it to someone in particular. And then you introduce yourself.
Okay, so my name is Jack McGimmon. I work here at the Communications Department at AUA, and I want to know, with Armenia and the crossroads that it's in right now, with all the geopolitical issues that it's having and the concerns, and there's West and there's Russia and so on and so forth, what needs to take place in the journalism atmosphere in Armenia to be able to articulate to audiences abroad who might not know about Armenian issues, whose country's leaders might be running on ideas of foreign policy that would involve Armenians' issues, for example. Basically, what I'm asking is, how can Armenian journalists articulate themselves to a more international audience?
Yeah, maybe Tom is the former international editor of AP.
Armenia is complicated. And it requires a kind of creative reporting that goes against the sort of normal categorization that people in a lot of Western countries, I think, would apply. And what I mean by that is that for news consumers in the United States and Western Europe and so forth at the moment, probably the big story, the big prism is Russia at the moment. That's the obsession, the focus of everything. So if we look at the South Caucasus, we can say that, well, what's the story in Georgia? Well, the story in Georgia, viewed from the West, is at least, so there's these pro-Russian people and the anti-Russian people and the parties and the ferment. They tend to look at Georgia that way, which side is going to prevail. And, for Azerbaijan, I suppose a lot of people will say, those people who know about Azerbaijan will probably say, well, we know at least that, they're not, they're kind of anti-Russian. They're really trying hard to establish their independence from Russia. Aliyah, Azerbaijan. Azerbaijan would like to see all the Russians gone from this region, of course, for their own reasons. Armenia is more complicated because Armenia has its legitimate reasons for wanting to maintain friendship with Russia and its legitimate reasons for wanting to maintain friendship with Iran. But from the Western standpoint, Russia, Iran, these are like, countries that don't have a lot of support. So Armenia is a very complicated place, and it has to be, the Armenian story has to be presented in a way that takes full account of the, complexity of this, and it's hard, and it probably involves trying to decolonize the coverage and the view of Armenia. That Armenia is not just, a former Soviet country. It's not just a country that has a conflict with Azerbaijan. It is a civilization and has civilizational and religious reasons and so forth that do connect it to the West and a very Western orientation among many Armenians. And that's the story that one has to present, but I acknowledge it's a complicated one.
And by the way, complication sort of gets in the way of international interest in a small country. A simple narrative that is compelling, rather than a lot of nuance and a requirement for intensive attention, that makes it easy. So yeah, Armenia's complication doesn't help you get attention.
Dan, I have a question for the panel, actually, if I may.
Please.
Especially for the journalists in Armenia. To what degree is your reporting aimed at the diaspora? Because that's a big part of the Armenia story, is that there are so many Armenians outside. And even as I was preparing for this panel, I didn't just go looking for Washington Post or New York Times articles. I went onto YouTube to see what I could find, produced by Armenian journalists. And I didn't find, maybe I was not looking in the right way, but I didn't see a lot of Armenian journalism in English for an external audience, but I found some fascinating stories about the complex things that are going on, and some of them were quite long, and they were compelling and interesting, and I watched them, and I learned a lot about, rural life in Armenia, for example, that I would have never known had I relied strictly on Western media.
Any other questions from you? Please.
I can only speak from my own personal perspective. The diaspora figures quite largely for us, and the reason we were in English and continue to remain reporting primarily in English is also for the diaspora communities, particularly in the United States and in Europe.
How much of your audience tends to be diaspora?
So when we started, I didn't think we would have much readership from Armenia. So again, it was international community, the diplomatic corps, the diaspora. But we soon realized that almost 40% of our viewership was coming from Armenia itself. And now it's, I would say 45, 55, or half-half. Half is from the outside, primarily again from the Western English-speaking countries, and the rest is from Armenia.
I mean, the questioner, it depends really on the audience. Armenian journalists, if they want to interest the world in Armenia, that's one type of story that you have to tell. If you want to move the needle on Armenian public opinion on whatever issue, for against the prime minister and his peace process and so forth, it's a wholly different way of telling the story. And I think that is a challenge, Lara, to your point about local journalists. Not only are they sometimes suspect, quote unquote, in the eyes of an international news organization, that they are unduly biased, but also it's a question of whether they can look at their own society with an outsider's perspective that is kind of essential for telling that story to an outsider, essentially seeing the forest and not the collection of trees.
I think it's very easy. It's been very easy for me as a journalist to situate Armenia within very important global stories. And I think how you pitch, sometimes this is approached with too much mystery. There aren't a lot of foreign correspondents here. Therefore, if you pitch a great story with credibility and you deliver it with credibility, you do stand a chance of getting much more coverage of Armenia. I think Armenia fits very neatly within the story of competition between the US and Russia for influence in the post-Soviet space, and that is a story with a long arc of interest right now, and that plays out in many fields. It certainly plays out in diplomacy and the peace process. It plays out now in the future of nuclear energy, who's going to be the preferred partner for the future of nuclear energy in Armenia. And I think it's fascinating, it has many, many aspects. And I think that story has a lot more yarn in it for any journalist who pitches it to regional or global outlets. The tech story, the empowered women story, women here doing incredible things. There are publications, non-Armenian ones, that are very interested in all of this. Green energy, Armenia could become a green energy exporting country at some point in our lifetimes, which is, so I do think that sometimes we forget that there are issues that live everywhere that are interesting generally, and if you can pitch Armenia within that, then it's a completely different thing. But also, I mean, you see this, to be fair, Syria deeply operated, of course, with the mission of increasing coverage from the Syrian war, but we're very happy to see many copycats of Syrian journalists starting to launch their own publications, and when we saw enough of that, we eventually folded down because it fulfilled the same mission. The Syrian gaze on the Syrian story, the Armenian gaze on the Armenian story is a very important one. And I think it's, I understand that people on another side of a conflict might say, oh, the Armenian reporter covering it is not legitimate. And I think that's completely unfair. It has to be taken on the craft itself. It's on that Armenian journalist. Everything I read about Armenia is 4 times more closely fact-checked and annotated than anything I read on anything else, because I know there will be suspicions because of my last name, fairly or unfairly. But, I think it's very unfair, and sometimes, in the case of the Syrian journalists, they were fetishized. We'd love to get Syrians writing about the Syrian, or Syrian fixer, or Syrian this. And I think it should be the case also because not only are Armenians here more often, but the bar for what we might find interesting is lower. So you're just going to get a higher frequency of reporting. And 1 out of 10 of those stories is going to be legitimately interesting to a non-Armenian, to people outside the civilization or the natural audience for that.
Well, of course, there's a trade-off between the suspicion of bias, which you suggest you bend over backwards to make sure that you put it away, versus the greater knowledge and understanding and sensitivity that a local reporter is going to have, even if they do, and in Maria's case openly do, present a certain narrative from a certain perspective. But I guess the model that you're talking about here is local journalists pitching stories to international outlets, getting around the fact that there are so few foreign correspondents here. And I mean, I was telling someone today, I'm ashamed to say, when I was a Europe editor for the Associated Press, we had an office in Moscow, obviously. We opened up an office in Kiev. We had stringers in most places, so freelancers who were local and not foreign. But I think for most of my time, we had no one in Armenia. And that is obviously shameful to me. I was hardly aware of it at the time. But there's an opening here for Armenian journalists to pitch stories. And without a doubt, it's a country full of interesting stuff. Anyone else? Please.
Yeah, no, it's on. Thank you.
American journalist
My aunts and uncles were the local reporters in Lebanon for UPI and for ABC during the Lebanese Civil War. So I was just a sneeze away from not having had the chance to be that foreign correspondent. I don't want to take up too much time here. We can talk after, but I get it. At the same time, I think for countries in crisis who want their voices heard, there's the private work and the societal work of healing from the trauma enough to be ready to stand up again and say, here's how I see it. Here's what's fair and unfair. Let me use our own universal standards of what's fair and unfair and tell you what I think is going on here. And so I do think there's a responsibility for those who do get the phone calls to do the private work of healing and making peace with the fact that this is how global media works. They have a lot of stories to cover. They tend to cover a country when it's a catastrophic, fire-burning, blood-shedding moment. And they'll only come around again when there's a higher level of fire burning. And that's how it is, otherwise it's not new. Right? And so if you want your voice heard, you have to make peace with that and be ready to know what your message is, and then communicate as much as you can when those calls come in.
I would certainly join Laura in urging you to say yes to the call and let your voice be heard, because the opposite is not productive, I think, to your own goals. And certainly I cannot disagree that some journalists are callous, and maybe they enjoy the coverage of war, and are not always sensitive, and will say, I hope you're okay, when you're clearly not okay. That said, I have to stand up for the honor of the foreign correspondent and say that I've known countless journalists, many of them white men, non-ethnic, who were genuine heroes. And some foreign journalists have lost their lives trying to bring across the story of, yes, oftentimes war, obviously, but it isn't, what causes a story to be told is not that some journalist gets satisfaction from covering other people's misery. The journalist, he or she, is sent there by the operation in question. And the operation in question is covering the war and not the peace, because that is what the audience finds interesting. We are waging a war here on human nature. Ask yourselves if you want to read a good news story about Sudan. My guess is the last time any in the audience here have read about Sudan was because of a war, or a coup, or some version of both. And there's not much we can do about that. Yes, Marie?
I know I'm not supposed to talk too much, but I do want to address what Jenny was saying because I share her frustration. But on November 9, 2020, when Armenia signed the ceasefire, and it was a devastating moment for us collectively as a nation, 2 days later I was at Dadibank, which was this ancient monastery that we knew was going to be handed over to Azerbaijan, and I had never been to Dadibank.